Hello everyone and welcome to my review slash retrospective of The Last of Us Part 2. So the game came out on June 19th, 2020 after many delays, and of course, as someone that is a big fan of the first game, I was honestly pretty skeptical going into Part 2. There were a lot of things pre-release and just what we knew beforehand before the game released that made me not entirely up to the idea of a sequel for The Last of Us. But as the days drew nearer, I got more and more excited. And then, of course, the leak happened. The massive leak that basically turned so many people off from the game. And almost me included. I became very skeptical, even more so, going into it. And I didn't quite know how to feel yet. And luckily, I waited to really decide until I played the game. This is a game that's full of so many different things, and I think in a lot of ways that's where it stumbles for most people. But for me, at the end of it, I couldn't have asked for any more. The game, in my opinion, just didn't disappoint. It delivered exactly what it wanted to, perfectly. It made me feel for these characters. It made me care about them. It made me hate them. It made me want to kill them. It made me want to save them. So much of what happens in this game is challenging to the player, and I've not experienced that in a game before. There wasn't any hesitation from the developers, and I really respect that. I respect that so much risk was taken with this game, because they easily could have just made it another adventure with Joel and Ellie, but imagine how boring that would have been. Imagine if this game came out and it was just more of the first game. I think, in a way, people would have complained then. But instead, we get this entirely different take on this world that we never could have imagined pre-release. And I think that's what I love about it. It's not here to tell this happy-go-lucky story. It's really here to tell a real and honest story. And there are a couple things I want to talk about in this review slash retrospective, and that's the idea that games don't have to please the player. And even though this game is really fun to play, as you can see in this gameplay, I personally think that this was just a very fun game. I really like the combat mechanics, the stealth, everything about it, the way that the AI reacts, the way that Ellie moves, her animations, everything like that. And, of course, the other playable characters, which we'll get into. But there's just so much going on in this game that I really have a hard time completely understanding why people discount it completely. The idea that it's a 0 out of 10, I think that's incredibly disrespectful and a complete disservice to the team behind the game. You know, there's this huge controversy surrounding the game as well about time crunch and the way that the developers were treated. And I think outright giving this game a complete 0 is very unfair to those people, especially when you have members of the gaming community speaking out against that, and then you give a game a 0 because you don't like what happens or you feel that there's an agenda at play. I think that that's just incredibly unfortunate that has happened, and I do feel like a lot of the discourse around this game is just completely unfair and frankly missing the point. I have a feeling that if the leaks hadn't happened and people experienced the story more naturally, without a windowed cut view of what the game is, I honestly feel that this would have been better received. It's a shame that we can't take risks anymore, apparently. We're not allowed to kill the main character. We're not allowed to do these things, even though people complain that games are just the same. You have people complaining that AAA games just don't take risks. They aren't worried about challenging the player or making them think or putting them in uncomfortable situations. They just are okay with FIFA and Call of Duty every year. And you have people that complain about that. And then when we get games like Death Stranding, we get games like The Last of Us Part 2, we get these games that kind of challenge ourselves and what we view games as, and we don't like that. That is something to me that I just don't understand. But with that all removed, how's the game itself? What did I think? Personally, I really enjoyed the game. I was, honestly, I'll be honest, going into it, I was skeptical. And the first few hours, I was kind of worried. And then a big moment happens, which I think by now I should be allowed to talk about spoilers willy-nilly. Yeah, so Joel dies. And I think if you didn't think this was going to happen, then did you even play the last game? There's just so much about the criticism surrounding this game that I just don't understand. I think it's pretty obvious, especially from promotional material way back when the game was announced in 2016. Yeah, of course Joel is going to die. Like, I didn't see any reason he wouldn't. I think it's unfortunate that people are reacting the way they are. Now, the argument's made that, he dies way too early. But I feel as though if he died later in the game, or at the end, or in the middle, it wouldn't have that potency. And that's what I think is so brilliant about this game, is it really makes you feel the emotions that the characters are feeling. When Abby brutally is murdering Joel, from Ellie's perspective, you're angry, you're upset, you're disgusted. And that's what the player was supposed to feel. However, later in the game, when you've seen more of Abby's perspective, and then you see that scene from Abby's point of view, yeah, you're still upset, yeah, you're still disgusted, but in a way, you can almost see that in Abby. I feel like Abby herself was regretting that. In the moment, it seems as though she kind of regretted doing it. And then that perpetrates the cycle of violence that we see in the game. You know, the WLF members, Owen and Mel and Manny and Abby, they decide, hey, we only came here for Joel. Let's leave Dina, let's leave Jesse, let's leave Jackson, let's leave Ellie all alone. And I think that was commendable on their part. And unfortunately, because of the cycle of violence, which is a major theme of the game, it came back to bite them. And that's unfortunate. Now, I beat the game about a day ago. It's been about a day since I beat the game, and it will not leave my mind. It cannot leave my mind. It has left me extremely contemplative and reflective, and honestly a little depressed. This is a game that's not, again, like I said, it's not here to hold your hand or make you feel good, and I really respect that in a lot of ways, because a lot of games can be about a power fantasy. They can be about complete wish fulfillment. And I really appreciate that this game, and even the last to an extent, the first game, didn't do that. Now, I know I'm kind of all over the place, but again, this is off the cuff, sort of a day after beating the game. And to me, the moments that stood out the most were the Abby points. Playing as Abby was my favorite part of the game. I did not expect to resonate and care for her character in the way I did. Her whole story with Lev, I think, was a very interesting reflection on Joel from the last game and his journey through that. And Abby kind of has that same moment, as well as mirroring Ellie in a lot of ways. Her father figure is now gone. Her father figure that she looked up to and loved and didn't want to leave her is now gone. And so she had to live with that for years, whereas Ellie is reacting to this right away. And of course, the big thing a lot of people are upset about is at the end of the end of the game, Ellie and Abby fight, and you can clearly tell neither of them want to fight. They're both fucked and done with this. They don't want it anymore. And Ellie decides, I'm not going to kill Abby. And never in a game while fighting someone, in an actual fight, hand to hand, have I really felt like that was another person. I was actually fighting Abby. I was actually going to kill her. I didn't want to. I thought that scene was so well done. And a lot of people are raising the idea of, well, why couldn't there have been a choice to either kill or not kill Abby? And fortunately, I personally think it's great that Naughty Dog didn't do that, because imagine the amount of people that are just going to kill Abby for the sake of it because they're outraged and whatnot. I think I'm very glad that Naughty Dog didn't do that, because I think the whole point of the story is finally realizing that there's no point to doing this anymore. And that's another criticism I'm seeing of the game is that, I think it's really stupid that the game ends up not meaning anything. There's no point to it all. And then I wonder if you've even played the first game. The first game, on a plot basis, is we have to get this girl to here. And then they do, and then the path completely changes, and then the end of the game, Joel brings her right back to Jackson. I think people are missing that point. And yes, the first game ended on a completely different emotional note than this game did. This game really kind of gut punches you to just give into it and move on. And I was not expecting that. And I really respected that decision. And I just think people are just not giving enough credit to the story. Of course, there are a lot more like-minded and civil people about it, but a lot of the criticisms I'm seeing about this game are just honestly missing the point. And I hate to say that because I don't want to sound like an asshole, but in a lot of ways, I feel like people are missing the point. However, I think that's my basic thoughts on the narrative. I do feel like it kind of struggled a little bit when you first started playing as Abby because you still have that resentment towards her. But by the third or fourth encounter / I guess it would have been encounter with Abby, I think I was fully on board. Basically, by the time that the first time you go to the aquarium was really when I was on board with Abby personally. I know some people it took about until Lev and Yara came into play, and that's fair, and I totally understand that. But I do think there are points where the story drags a little bit, and it does feel a little long. Because looking back on it, it's really hard for me to remember certain moments in the game, but as I'm seeing footage or watching gameplay or a review, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember this part. This part was great. But sitting here right now, I've kind of forgotten it. The end is really what's sticking in my mind, and a lot of the bigger moments, right? Jesse dying, Tommy being brutally beat, Joel obviously dying, and things like that. Now, what do I think of the gameplay itself? I think it's an improvement on pretty much everything that Naughty Dog has ever done. I think the gameplay here is brilliant. I said that at the beginning of the review. I think these environments are crazy. In the first game, it was very much a corridor into an open area, into a corridor, into an open area. In this game, it's so many different combinations of level design, and I think it's some of the best environments I've ever played through in a game. It's incredible how much detail and complexity is put into these environments and how big they are. There's so many fights, especially early on with Ellie, where, you're like, oh, it's just this little like area alleyway or these couple houses. No, there's like 7 different houses and a massive field and a barn and all this. And that was really impressive to me. I really enjoyed that, how big these environments and combat scenarios ended up being, because I really wasn't expecting that. I was expecting a little more linearity and closed doors, but there are going to be about a million billion ways to play through each scenario in this game, and that's really awesome to me. Like the footage you're seeing here, I recorded after I beat the game, because there's a really great feature where you can replay encounters, and just the fluidity of restarting and playing through these parts of the games that I didn't play through before, in the same way I did now. And I think that's really a testament to the level design, personally, and just the way that the combat scenarios were put together. There are, just like any game, there's a little bit of jank when it comes to the gameplay, especially when there's so many complex systems at play here. And yeah, it's not perfect. Gameplay wise, like there are moments when you're like, oh, that's a little awkward. But one thing I really appreciate that not a lot of people are talking about, especially in reviews when they mention the gameplay, is the quick swap feature. If you press R1, it'll just swap to whatever weapon. It's basically like weapon cycling. I think that's a really great feature. A big part of the first game was, or one of the biggest frustrations with the first game was, it's a kind of awkward menuing system, and they've streamlined so much of it here, and I really appreciate that. Another thing I really enjoyed from a gameplay perspective was how each different character played. In the first game, Joel has a very certain archetype that you can go to. You have to craft these shivs, you can craft nail bombs, you can do these certain things, and you're kind of a brawler up close and these melee weapons. Whereas with Ellie, she's much more agile, and she can craft arrows, which was brilliant. I loved that. Ellie is a much more mobile, stealthy build play through kind of character. And Abby is much more of a stoic brute, but at the same time can do these minute things. Very much a tank kind of build if you want to go that way. And she has certain upgrades that can help with scavenging and crafting and making ammo, certain ammo types. I thought that was really cool. And I think from a lore and world perspective, that's really interesting that each person is surviving in this world completely differently. And that's super interesting to think about. Like in my mind, I'm like, okay, well, how is Tommy, how does Tommy work in this world? Oh, he's a sniper. He really likes using long range guns. And you see some of that in the game, which I thought was really cool. And I thought that brought a lot to the table. It reminded me of sort of that swap that you have in the first game, in the winter section as Ellie. When you start playing as her, like you kind of in a way start playing completely differently because Ellie has certain strengths. She can't melee fight as easily. She can be attacked a lot easier. And one thing I've completely forgotten to mention is the dodge mechanic. I think that's a great mechanic. It really added to the tense and fluidity of the fights. It's more up to the player's skill than the game's will, which I really liked the dodge mechanic. And there's so many things I could probably go into further here, but I just want to say that I think personally this is my favorite game that I've played so far this year, and I've played a lot of them. Final Fantasy VII Remake, Persona 5 Royal, and I'm Resident Evil 3, and I plan on getting to Doom Eternal someday. But so far this year, this is an experience I'm not going to forget. I think the lasting impression of this game is going to be its main thing in the gaming sphere. I think this is a game years from now that people are going to appreciate a lot more, because I think it's going to become a lot more like Metal Gear Solid 2, where at first people hated that game when it came out. People hated it. Like, I really recommend you go and check out some reviews from when the game first came out, and reactions to it at the time. People hated it, man. People were not happy with that game. But over time, it's now regarded as one of the best games ever. People consider it better than the first. People consider it better than the third game. It's highly regarded, and I think that's going to happen a lot with Part 2. And that's something that going into it, I was like, I'm going to appreciate this game for its story and what it has to offer, and I will be critical of it. And like Dina, for example, I just didn't get Dina. I didn't really care. I wasn't all there for Dina. However, that didn't really matter because all the other characters I was super into. I really enjoyed Yara. I really enjoyed Yev. I loved seeing Owen and it's sort of his innocence that he had left, and his relationship with Abby. I didn't care for Mel that much. I thought Tommy felt a little out of character at points. There are criticisms I have with this game, but in a lot of ways, it's a bigger and better game than the first. Yes, the first is a lot more focused, but I think when it comes to Part 2, I was just blown away by so much of it. It's a bigger and better experience for me personally, and I wouldn't be surprised if this ends up being my game of the year. We have Ghosts of I can never say the name correctly. Ghosts of Tsushima. Pardon me. That comes out later in July, and then of course the big boy that everyone is really excited for, which is Cyberpunk 2077. But I don't think that those games are going to have that much of a controversial lasting impression as The Last of Us Part 2. This is easily an experience I've never had before in a game. Close enough is probably Red Dead Redemption 2's story, and maybe even Red Dead Redemption 1, and the way that it leaves the player feeling at the end of it all. And in fact, the epilogue kind of in this game before the final act, where you're on the farm with Dina and Ellie, kind of reminded me of Red Dead Redemption 2, when you start to play as John and you start building your homestead. It reminded me a lot of that, kind of the reflective, I'm in this relationship with this person that I love, with my son, and we're just kind of living our life. And then Sadie comes along and says, hey, we got to do this. And then, it kind of leads into the falling action of that game. And it was very similar here with Part 2. And yeah, I genuinely think it's one of the best games I've ever played. Now, will I play it again? Probably. There's that discussion going around that it's a great game, but it really leaves you empty at the end, that you kind of don't you almost don't want to play it again. However, I plan on trying out the New Game Plus. I never really messed around with New Game Plus with The Last of Us Part 1. I wasn't appealing to me. I didn't really find that interesting that you can just have your upgrades again. But I'm really interested how it works here because of the way Abby and Ellie, you swap between them constantly throughout the game. Whereas in the first game, you're just Joel and then Ellie. Sarah at the very beginning. But I'm sure there's about 1,000 more things I could say. I plan to bring up the game on my podcast, the Semanticast. I recommend that you stay tuned for that, subscribe for that. That'll probably be in episode 3. I don't really know exactly. This is a game that I'm going to be talking about and thinking about for a long time. And it's easily one of the best games I've played. The environments, the characters, the story really hit me on a level that I didn't expect it to, especially going into it super skeptically. And I really recommend the game. I do recommend the game. Definitely play the first before you play this one. But if I had to give it a score, probably about a 9 out of 10. I'm hesitant to give it out of 10 because there were parts where I was genuinely miserable playing it. Not in the sense that the game wanted me to be miserable, but like when you first start playing as Abby, I was not on board. When you first get to Seattle, and even though it's this amazing open environment where you can go anywhere and scavenge and it felt very dynamic and natural. At the same time, I didn't feel like that was a great way to start the actual gameplay. So there are my criticisms, but at the same time, I think this is a story that really, really needed to be told, whether or not people want to accept it as canon or not. Like, I think it's ridiculous that people want to, they want to completely have the writers rewrite it. And I'm so sick of that in pop culture right now. Like, if a story comes out and you have your problems with it, you either reject it or you bully the creator, or you want it completely removed from canon or whatever. I think that's ridiculous. Even a movie, like, I don't care for The Last Jedi too much. I respect it, but I don't want it like redone. I think that's incredibly disrespectful for everyone that worked on the movie. But whatever. Have you played The Last of Us Part 2? And if you have, what did you think? Are you thinking about playing it? If you haven't, I would be really interested to hear your take on a lot of the game because it worked for me. It honestly really worked for me, and it's going to be one that I remember for a long time. Anyways, guys, thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have a good one. And, as always, stay strong, everyone.